is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, for holding such an incredibly important hearing about, I think, a really critical issue, especially because many of these broken systems and structures that we continue to talk about, these existed prior to the pandemic, and if anything, the pandemic just exposed how broken they are. So I'm so incredibly grateful for my colleague from New York, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, for leading the charge and reintroducing the Public Banking Act this Congress. Chairwoman Waters, thank you. Thank you for always wanting to continue to speak these truths about these broken structures within our country and our communities, especially communities of color. You know, I represent the third poorest congressional district in the country. And so when people say why I do these things, it's because, you know, I move with a sense of urgency. I don't got days or weeks for my residents. They are literally dying because they have no access to thrive. Nearly 20%, a quarter of the U.S. adults are unbanked and underbanked. And one of the most profound ways that this discrepancy has affected my residents is in housing. And this is not just somewhere to sleep, y'all. This is where people use their housing to put their kids through college, to get out of poverty. It's stability. So it is really bizarre. I mean, some of them, maybe not bizarre. Maybe there's a different word when people say too big to fail. We got to bail them out right now. And what a funny thing, too big to fail. How about this? People are too important to fail. People in our country. So when people talk about funding and all this stuff, I keep hearing $700 billion to bail out the big banks. Guess what, y'all? Special Inspector General says that the total was more like 16.8 trillion, 4.6 trillion has already been paid out. The Great Recession that killed neighborhoods in my district was because of big banks. They devastated our local economy. Literally foreclosures at the highest rates we've ever seen, historic unemployment rates, destroyed families in this country. It was the big banks. That's who did it. So when we introduce bold initiatives where we say everyone should be included, we should have accessibility. We should not be judged for trying to do what's right. Because when I look at Michigan, we lost more Black home ownership than anywhere in the country. 2019 home ownership, Black Americans in my community dropped. It dropped to the lowest level, y'all, since fair housing law enacted in 1968. You hear me? That's how low it's gotten. It's close to 40% now. People used to envy Detroit, used to look at Wayne County, Michigan and say, man, how are they able to lift people out of poverty? It was because of housing. So when commercial banks shut out Black and brown people from lending, they're just closing the door on home ownership. They're closing the door on saving for children's education, opportunity to build businesses, ability to retire with dignity. And so it is hard for me to hear my colleagues sometimes judging my residents, because guess what? Majority of my colleagues are millionaires. They're in an income bracket that is so disconnected with the majority of American people in this country. They don't understand what it means to live check by check. I remember the first time I was here, people were wondering, why are the federal employees in the food bank line? What are you talking about? You just shut down government. They live check by check, y'all. Of course they're in the food bank line. They got to feed their children and their families. So Ms. Meriden, you know, I want to talk to you about how would access to public banking help residents in my community move towards homeownership and build wealth?
Thank you for articulating that contrast really well. Access to public banking for residents is exactly what access to public banking for banks would do. It saves them. It throws them a lifeline when they're out of liquidity. This is what we did in the financial crisis. So to people who say, oh, well, let the private market do it, the private market would have failed. It would have been a completely bankrupt market in 2008, in 2020, again. And the public fisc, the Federal Reserve, along with the Treasury and Congress, came in to save a lot of those public banks, and they asked them politely to please send some of those funds onto individuals, and they had the choice, and they decided not to in some cases. And so this is when we talk about public money going to people, it's the same way that we do with banks. And if banks aren't choosing certain communities to help, as they have not chosen, then we remedy that directly. It's just taking the middleman out. This is not a revision. This is not radical.
No, it's about accessibility. Yeah. It's just period. It's like they don't want all of us to have access. You know, really last thing, and because during the pandemic, you know, one of the things that came up is obviously the Paycheck Protection Program. And guess who screwed my residents? The banks. In my district, smaller Black-owned businesses struggle to pay the PPP program aid they needed because they lack pre-existing relationships with big banks. I had to call Chairwoman Waters a number of times to tell her this bank is doing this bank is doing that. Ms. Del Rio, would public banking make administration of economic stimulus programs like the PPP program or the economic impact payments faster and more efficient for our communities?
Yes, it would. And you can see that in public banks throughout the world, including in North Dakota, which had the highest rate per capita of PPP loans, in part because of what the Bank of North Dakota did to help local lenders get those funds out. And I'll say also that in New York and nationally, CDFI, small lenders, had an outsized role in getting PPP funds out to small businesses. My relatively tiny $85 million CDFI credit union that I serve on the board of, for example, made
Ms.
more than
Del Rio.
$1 billion in PPP.
Gentlelady's time has expired. No other members are here. I want to compliment and thank everybody. This is the best attended hearing this committee